Hi guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Welcome back to my channel. And yes, I'm Natalia Suri and this is my channel. So today I have Mr. Siddhartha Sarma with me. I'm going to talk to him about his book. But before that, I want to share a few lines about him. He is an author, he's an historian, a journalist, recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award for Children Literature in English for his novel The Grasshopper's Run. We are going to talk to him about his novel The Ear of the Weeds. And I'm going to talk to him about political fiction. Is political fiction good for children? Should children read political fiction? And all these topics. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Come, let us talk to him. Hi, sir. Thank you so much for joining in. Welcome to my channel.
Hi, good morning and good evening.
So my first question is, we are going to talk about your book, Ear of the Weeds. So what is your latest novel, Ear of the Weeds, about?
The Year of the Weeds is based on a real series of events in Western Orissa. It's called Yamgiri agitation. So it was a land rights movement by a very small tribal group against a rather large mining company. So the company wanted to open a bauxite mine on their sacred hill. So the tribe launched agitation that lasted for a little more than a decade. So finally, the Supreme Court allowed them to vote on whether they could have the mine or not, and they rejected it. So that was a landmark judgment, a landmark event in the history of land rights movements in India. So I wanted to write about that, but as I started researching it, as I started writing the novel, I realized there were a lot of connected issues about how India works, how villages work, how our policymakers work. So I thought I would include all of that. So that's what became the novel.
And why did you choose this topic of land right movements in Odisha? Any particular reason?
Yeah, so I follow land rights movements. They're among the many things that I have followed over the years. And there are a lot of land rights movements going on across India, where indigenous communities, underprivileged communities, marginalized communities are fighting for rights to their land for various reasons, for dams, for mines. And these are of concern not only to them, but also to the rest of the country. Because of ecological reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, sociological reasons, for all these reasons, the rest of the country needs to hear more about these movements, about these events. We keep hearing about forests which are suddenly sold or given to corporates and mining companies and other things. The effect of these policies is not only ecological, it not only affects us ecologically, but also sociologically. It causes a lot of disturbance in the fabric of the communities that live around these areas. So I wanted to write a novel that talks about these problems, these issues. They are also connected to how India functions, how the government functions, how bureaucracy functions, how the courts function. All of these are connected. So I thought I'd put all of them together in a novel that talked about all these issues.
So why such political stories become important today?
Yeah. In a way, you could say that they have become important now, but in another way, you could say they have always been important. If you look back, and I just want to go a little far back here, if you look at the generation that got us independence, they were not seasoned politicians. They were not people in their 50s and 60s who had come up through political parties. They were young people, teenagers, people in their early 20s who were filled with passion, who were patriotic in the true sense of the term, who knew their country, who knew what their people lived through, and they coordinated and led the freedom movement. So they were political. Humans have always been political. Just that in recent years, we have come to, especially in the middle classes, urban middle classes in India, we have come to think of, to be politically aware is not the same thing as to be a politician. But we have conflated the two. We have confused the two. So there is no harm in being politically aware, because one needs to be aware of one's rights as a citizen, of how one is related to the state, how the government functions, on whose wishes the government should function. We don't engage with that enough. We are not aware of how the rest of the country lives. We are not aware of even little things like what the constitution is all about, right? So we need, although we also need other genres in fiction, we need other kinds of writing for children, but increasingly, considering the world in which we live, where there is an absence of empathy, where there is an absence of awareness about rights and how the country is supposed to work, where there is an absence of engagement with democratic principles, increasingly we need novels which have political themes. This is not propaganda. This does not mean that, if you believe in a certain ideology, you are going to feed it to your children or make them, coerce them into believing in that kind of ideology. It just means that you make your children, or the children that you engage with, you make them politically aware. You make them understand what it means to live in a society. You make them step out of their cocoons of privilege and see how the rest of the state, how the rest of the society, how the rest of the country or the world live. And that is the only way to save whatever we have right now. If you look at the way people are reacting to the migrant workers problem, it shows that there is a lack of empathy among the middle classes who ought to know better. Where does that lack of empathy comes from? It comes from the fact that they have not been taught any of these things. Textbooks talk about a few things from the Constitution and a few things about voting and rights and duties, and that's it. And you grow up and you are a citizen only theoretically, but you have no awareness of how the rest of the country lives, or how to deal with them, how to have some empathy for them. And these are things that you can only get through fiction and through political fiction. So it's increasingly important that we deal with these topics in fiction.
Sir, I read in one of your interviews you said, I wanted to tell a story about the systems and processes at work in the country, how government functions, how a large part of India, which has virtually disappeared from the mind space of the other part, survives. Now, why did you feel this way?
First, because as a journalist, I have seen through, during my career, at the beginning of my career, there was still some coverage of rural India, or what is called the periphery. But afterwards, especially in the last 7 or 8 odd years, this has completely vanished. So rural India is not mentioned at all. Maybe a few news stories you'll find on farmers' suicide, or occasionally, a few things related to agriculture, because, indirectly people still realize that agriculture is important for them, even if they live in the cities. But apart from that, there is just no engagement with large parts of the country, and they've just disappeared. We don't know. We don't talk about them. We don't want to know about them. So I saw it happen in my profession. I saw it happen in journalism. Which means it happened in the public consciousness. So I wanted to talk about it because especially if you talk in an urban context where there's a lot of privilege, there's a lot of insulation from how the government functions. We don't have to go to a police station every other day to deal with things. We don't have to deal with courts unless we commit a crime. We don't have to deal with bureaucrats just to get ration and things like that. But that is something that the underprivileged have to go through. That is something that villagers go through all the time. So, most of India still lives at the mercy of this massive structure called the government. And we have stopped talking about it. So I thought I had to, and I thought I'd present a small part of it in book.
Sir, you think that this major problem lies in the population also, that India is exploding and over here one person is striving against the other, and we are so much involved in our lives that we have literally forgotten even who our neighbor is? the whole concept of humanity has literally disappeared away. And the best part is the government, because I stay in Delhi, what I see is the government never talks about population explosion. When we were kids, we used to read Hum Do Hamare Do, but those ads and those concepts have just vanished out. And simple people who come to work, they have got 5, 5, 10 children. So you feel the problem is there?
There are several parts to what you have mentioned, right? There are several aspects to it. The first thing is about the poor having a lot of children. A lot of studies have shown, including Dr. Abhijit Mukherjee's work on poverty. They've shown how or why the poor are compelled to have large families. A lot of it has to do with mortality rates, uncertain social structures, right? So you can't really blame the poor for having a lot of children, because that is how it has always been. What needs to be dealt with is the government, as you pointed out, the government's approach to it, right? Till some time ago, as you mentioned, we used to talk about controlling population. We used to talk about the problems of having a large population in a small country, right? But then suddenly we started talking about things which made no sense, like a demographic dividend and so on. This demographic dividend term came out very recently, like about 5 or 6 years ago. Before that, nobody was talking about it. Now suddenly we are saying we have a young population, we have an advantage, but that advantage can only occur if they are educated properly, if they have the infrastructure to get jobs, right? Merely having a large young population is a recipe for disaster, because if your economy is not working, if they don't have jobs, there'll be civil unrest, which is what is happening now. So what we were given, instead of policies to tackle with population explosion, we were given these terms, these meaningless terms with no policy behind. So population explosion is a problem. The poor are not to blame. Government policy is to blame. There has never been a long-term policy about dealing with any of it. Now, the third part of what you said was whether all of this is connected to the fact that we don't have empathy, we don't care about one another. Some of it, yes. But if you look at, there are a lot of countries which might not have the kind of population we have, but they have, you could say, the population density is much higher than India, right? Small countries with large population, there are a lot of, especially in Southeast Asia. But they don't have a sociological problem. They don't have the absence of empathy. They still have societies that care about one another. So the problem, as far as I could see from my time traveling around India reporting on it, the problem is not the large population of India. The problem is the social structures that remove empathy. Okay. For instance, why do we have misogyny? Because at the very micro level in families, women are invisible. They are denied agency, they are denied rights, they are denied equality. Now, expanded to the larger social scale, the man who is brought up in a family where the woman is invisible will treat women in the larger society also as invisible, right? Misogyny is entrenched in our families, it is entrenched in our societies. Caste is entrenched in our families, it is entrenched in our societies. Communalism, though, is there only. So you put all these together, you don't have one society, you have multiple societies. You have probably as many societies as you have families, and most of the families are dysfunctional. So you have severe sociological problems. Large population probably compounds it, but I still think even if we had a manageable population, these problems would remain because these are sociological problems. Absence of empathy is because we don't see the next person as a fellow human being. We see him or her in terms of gender, in terms of caste, in terms of other identities. So I was talking about the ecological aspect of it. If you look at what is happening today, nature returning to places where these kind of activities stop, that is certainly there. So yeah, in a way, I was talking about this absence of balance between economic activity and nature. Yes, I was thinking of ecology.
So you grew up in Guwahati, Assam during the high tide of insurgency, under a lot of political violence. Now you feel those years reflect in your work and in your writing.
Yes, they do. They do a lot actually. So one of the things that happens when you grow up in a period of great unrest is you don't take peace for granted. It was a very difficult time back then in the Northeast, in Assam, a lot of other states also. Uh, what happens is, as I said, we don't take peace for granted. We try to understand why violence takes place. We try to come to terms with it. Sometimes it leaves a lot of trauma. It leaves a lot of psychological issues. For instance, if you look at my generation, which grew up in Kashmir, which was the first generation which grew up with insurgency and with martial rule in the valley, they have severe psychological issues, and the generations that came after them also, right? Um, so it leaves you scarred. It leaves you also politically aware. If you are inclined towards reflection, then you start thinking about why violence happens, why political violence happens. You try to make sense of it. So in my case, I decided to be a journalist because I wanted to understand how societies work, how governments work, and I wanted to write about it. So after I became a journalist, I went back, I covered the Northeast, I wrote about insurgency, I wrote about politics, I tried to make sense of what had happened through history. So definitely my childhood, my initial years under insurgency, under political violence, has influenced the way I look at it.
Is there any example which you would like to say? Because you're saying and the other person's, getting it becomes more deep if you remember anything from your childhood. Any example you would like to share?
Well, no specific instance. Uh, we grew up under curfew. We grew up under martial rule, president's rule, and there was a lot of violence. So it made me ask why the violence was happening, right? Uh, for instance, if you grow up in a place where violence usually does not happen, where political violence does not happen, when curfews do not happen, and you hear of these things happening somewhere else, and the media tells you that it's the public which is inciting the government to do it, then you might think, yeah, maybe that's right, because the government can't do things like that, because what you see of the government and what people in these disturbed areas see of the government are two different things. For instance, how do you relate with the police? When we grew up, we just didn't trust the police because not only were they corrupt, as all policemen are across India, but they were also extremely brutal. So for somebody growing up in South Bombay in the 1980s, a policeman would be just a fellow in a uniform who would talk to you in English if you wanted to, and who would give you direction, right? And at worst would probably ask for a bribe if you broke a traffic rule. But a policeman in the Northeast is a fellow with a gun who shoots people. So your engagement with the government or with its organs becomes that much more complex. You look at bureaucrats, right? Somebody in a big city of my generation would not see a bureaucrat at all unless there were bureaucrats in the family, because there is no need for dealing with bureaucracy. You go to a private school, your parents work in a private organization, everything is in the private sector. But in the disturbed areas, in the peripheries of India, the government is everything. So you know who the DC is, you know who the block development officer is, who the subdivisional magistrate is, because these are the people you see walking around the city or the town with CRPF or army men arresting people and putting them in jail. So you see how the government functions. So your entire engagement with the idea of governance and with the state is very different. You start fearing these organs. So I can give you specific instances like this. Most of what I know about bureaucrats from my childhood was seeing them on the streets, going to people's houses and picking people up. So these were not theoretical ideas that I had. These were not things that I learned in a book. I saw the government at work on the street, and I didn't like it. So this is how it affects you.
So my last question is, if you had to recommend any political novels for children, which ones are the ones which you would recommend? And firstly, should children read? That is very important because all this has got a very dark side to it. So exposing a child at a young age to such a dark side, is it good? Should children read, and which ones?
Right. The first thing is, I think every child has a different reading level. It's not just about the age, but it's also about the mindset, the mentality, the receptiveness of that child. So the first thing is the parent or the teacher has a very important role to play in this. Not as a gatekeeper, not as somebody who wants to prevent the child from becoming politically aware, but to mediate the process. So they have to play a proactive role in understanding the individual requirements of the child. There are some children who just do not, and this is very important, which I've discovered. There are some children who just do not connect with political issues. Right? They are very happy if you talk to them about Harry Potter or fantasy, which is a great genre. I love fantasy. I follow it. There's no problem with it. But there are some children who are very happy reading such books. They might not respond at all to realistic works or to political fiction or these serious topics that we just talked. They will just not respond to it. It's better to leave them to their fantasy world. Let them be happy there. So if you're a mother and you want to read, you want your child to read Yarugvi, but she does not want to read political fiction, she wants to read fantasy, then you should come to terms with it. Just be happy that your child reads, right? So that's the first step, to come to terms with the fact that some children will not be interested in. Now for the other children, you also have to first go through the book to see if it does have a lot of violence, or if it does have things that you find might potentially disturb your child. Then you should be careful about exposing your child to these things. However, if you think the novel or the non-fiction work has enough ideas of value to give to the child, then you should introduce the child to that kind of thing. If there is a little violence, that's all right. Children are exposed to violence in so many ways. Your child is probably playing an extremely violent computer game with no political background. So one shouldn't worry too much about exposing the child to real world events. But yes, one should look at what the book talks about. And also it could be a learning process for the parent. So there should be some mediation, but not gatekeeping. That's what I think.
And sir, any recommendations?
Right. One of my favorite political fiction books from India is No Guns at My Son's Funeral by Paru Anand. That is one way of writing. That is probably the best way of writing about political violence and about politics in a society to a child, where it talks about both the experiences of children and the experiences of parents who are facing this kind of violence. Another very good book which deals with these issues in a very creative manner, in a manner that should be followed by other writers, that I found very inspiring, very instructive, is Ranjit Lal's The Battle for Number 19, which again is based on communal conflict, a topic which is not much explored in children's fiction. It is beginning to be explored now. It should have been done much earlier. So these are two books that I would recommend. Ranjit Lal and Paru Anand are among our finest writers, not just for children, but also in English literature in India. So these two books stand with the best in the world in terms of dealing with political events. There are a lot of other such books, but these are the two best ones that I can think of. The other thing that I wanted to mention here was there's a lot of non-fiction about political things that children can read. Some of it might not be meant for children. They might be meant for general readers, but children can read them. But one of the areas in which I think there is an absence, especially in English fiction, is partition literature. Now that you have communal conflict occurring across the country, we need to talk to children about this. We need to talk to children about secularism. We need to talk to them about how a secular society was supposed to be built. The dreams of our founding fathers. And to do that, we need to engage with partition. So I would be really happy if we had some more partition literature for children coming up. Not necessarily that it has to be extremely violent. It does not have to be Manto Part 2. But it should be realistic, and it should talk to children about these issues, because we will be facing these issues more and more. We need more fiction about economics, about rural areas, about agriculture, about farmers. We will be seeing more of that, but we do need more of it than we have been seeing.
Lovely, sir. Lovely talking to you. It was wonderful, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your channel, and I look forward to more interactions of yours with other writers. Thank you.
So guys, we were in conversation with Mr. Siddhartha Sarma. You have any questions, my email address is given below. Do share your views and comments. And yes, don't forget to subscribe. It is extremely encouraging to see those figures going up. And yes, another thing which I want to share with all my subscribers is that I have started my own blog by the name of www.nataliasuri.com. It's on religious mysteries. It's about my experiences across the globe and about the mysteries which I saw, especially in the genre of religion, and the articles which I have shared here. Do join me on this blog. It would be wonderful. And yes, do tune in my next video, which I'll be posting in very soon. Don't forget to smile. You look beautiful when you smile. Don't forget that. Take care of yourself. Bye.